Hello, and welcome back to this new section where we are going to talk about Amazon's main storage service known as Simple Storage Service, which is commonly referred to as S3. So over here on the Orion papers, make sure we are on our accounts and services layer, and then go ahead and click on AWS account and then onto storage. So the first thing that you'll notice here inside of our account container is that we're going to have something called storage transit services. Now we are going to talk about these later on in this section, but these are all the various ways that we can get data into and out of S3. Then as a part of S3, we're also going to talk about Glacier. And even though Glacier is still considered a part of S3, for the most part, AWS actually does break it up here into two separate services on their console, which is why we have it broken up here into two separate services as well. But for the duration of this particular lesson, let's dive into S3 and let's talk about S3 essentials, and then we'll talk about S3 buckets, objects, and folders. So first, let's click here onto S3 essentials. And let's talk and get a good understanding about what S3 is before we move on. So S3, as AWS's main storage service, S3 can serve many purposes when designing highly available, fault-tolerant, and secure application architecture, including bulk, meaning basically unlimited static object storage, various storage classes to optimize cost versus needed object availability and durability, object versioning, access restrictions via S3 bucket policies and permissions, object management via lifecycle policies, hosting static files and websites, can also be an origin for our CloudFront CDN, and file shares and backup/archiving for hybrid networks. And we'll talk more about that when we discuss AWS Storage Gateway. So here are some really important facts that you need to know about S3. Objects do stay within a particular AWS region and are synced across all availability zones for high availability and durability. So when you upload an object to an S3 bucket, that object is actually synced multiple times across all of the availability zones in the region that you choose. Now that's very important to understand because that's what allows for S3 to have such high durability and availability. Next is that you should always create an S3 bucket in a region that makes sense to its purpose, meaning are you serving content to particular customers in a certain region of the world? Or are you sharing data with an EC2 instance that again is in a particular region? You don't want to have an S3 bucket in Asia when you're serving content to customers or an EC2 instance that are in the United States, right? You want to have them both in the same region or at least as close as possible. Next is S3 read consistency rules. Now, again, this is something that is very important to know and memorize for the AWS CSA exam. First is that all regions now support read after write consistency for puts of new objects into S3. So basically what that means is that an object can be immediately available after putting it into S3. Now, all regions, however, use eventual consistency for puts overriding existing objects and delete of objects. So what that means is that there may be a very small or slight delay for overriding existing objects or deletes of objects for those changes to be reflected for other people viewing the object. Okay, so next, let's close out of here and let's jump into S3 buckets and also open up S3 over here in our console. So under storage here, it can be found for S3. The first thing, if you've never used S3 before, is it's going to ask you to create a bucket. So let's click on create a bucket, and then let's talk a little bit about what buckets are. So buckets are the main storage container of S3 and contain a grouping of information and have subname spaces which are similar to folders but aren't folders, but they're called folders, and I'll explain exactly what that means in a minute. Also, tags can be used to organize buckets, meaning you can use tags to organize buckets based on the application that it belongs to. Now, when creating a bucket, we must understand that each bucket must have a unique name across all AWS. So it's not just within your account. It literally means every single user in AWS. So I have no buckets created in my account right now, and if I just were to create a bucket called test, I'll select a region here, I'll select US standard, and click create, it's going to give me an error because somebody somewhere else in somebody else's account has the bucket name test. So they must be unique across all AWS, all accounts, all users, not just you and your account, all other accounts. Very important to understand. Also, something that's really important to understand as well is that even though you have to choose which region to create a bucket in, S3 as a service is actually global, meaning that you can view all of your S3 buckets that are in different regions all in the same space. You don't have to switch between regions to view different buckets like you would say with EC2, how you have to switch between regions to view the EC2 instances that you have provisioned in those various regions. So let's go ahead, let's create a new bucket here with a name that is unique to this particular, which is totally unique. And again, when I make this bucket name here, you will not be able to make this bucket name. Well, let's try Orion Papers and see if that is taken. Probably is, but let's create it. Now, I got another error here, and this is something that's also very important to be aware of. It says a bucket name in a region must contain only lowercase characters. So I have to switch that to a lowercase o. Let's try to create it again. So that wasn't taken, so I got Orion Papers as a bucket name. So nobody in the history of S3 has used that particular bucket name. So that's great. So a couple of other things that we want to understand about buckets, and there are some bucket limitations, and that is only 100 buckets can be created in an AWS account at a time, and bucket ownership, meaning owner right here, this is me, Thomas, okay, cannot be transferred once a bucket is created. So I can't transfer this to another account is basically what is happening here. Now that we have finished talking about buckets, let's move on to objects and folders. However, before we do that, I do want to switch the S3 console over to their new version of the console. What you're looking at right here has been the console that AWS has been using for S3 for many years. However, they've just recently released a new updated console, which I'm going to use for the remainder of this S3 section. However, for some people, it may not immediately come up because it's still in beta testing. However, I just want to kind of walk you through how to force that new console look to appear so that you can properly follow along for the rest of this course. So what I want you to do is exit out of S3, click back into S3, and then under the Properties tab here, you should see this opt-in labeled right here, opt-in. And now we see that we get a brand new look for AWS S3. So this is what I'm going to be using for the remainder of this section, as this is going to be the new console that AWS is going to use moving forward. So I want to make sure that our videos are up to date and we're using the most current version of the AWS console. So we do see here that we have Orion Papers, our bucket, and I can click on that to go into the bucket and see more options like to upload, and that's what we're going to do in a second. We're going to upload an object to this particular bucket. So let's talk a little bit about what S3 objects are. So objects are static files that contain metadata information, basically a set of name key pairs, and contain information specified by the user and AWS information such as storage type. So to continue on that thought, each object must be assigned a storage type, and we're going to talk about that in great detail later on in this section. And the storage type determines the object's availability, durability, and cost. By default, all objects are private. Now, also important to understand that objects can be as small as 0 bytes and as large as 5 terabytes. They can have multiple versions if versioning is enabled. They can be made publicly available via a URL. They can be automatically switched to a different storage class or deleted via lifecycle policies. They can be encrypted using AES 256-bit encryption, and they can be organized into subname spaces called folders. So a little bit about object encryption. So you can enable server-side encryption, otherwise known as SSC, and this is where S3 can encrypt the object before saving it on the partitions in the data centers and decrypt it when it is downloaded. And again, this uses AES 256. Or you can use your own encryption keys. This is considered client-side encryption when you encrypt the data before you upload. And S3 can also provide SSL-terminated endpoints for the API. So over here in the S3 console, let's go about uploading our first object. So let's click on Upload, click on Add Files, and we will upload here S3 sample file. Choose, click Next. Now here's where we can have several different options. We can choose to manage users and manage their rights, and also manage public permissions. But we're going to get into this during our permissions lesson of this section. For now, I'm just going to click on Next. Here, we can also select the storage class, whether we want to select standard, standard and frequent access, or reduced redundancy. Also, if we want to set various levels of encryption and add our own metadata. But for now, I'm just going to leave this all as default and click Next, and then click Upload. So we now see that in our bucket Orion papers, we have our S3 sample file uploaded. So next, let's talk about folders. Basically, for simplicity, S3 supports the concept of folders, and this is done only as a means of supporting groupings of objects. And Amazon does this by using key name prefixes for objects. So it's kind of important to understand that Amazon has a flat structure in an S3 bucket. There is no hierarchy like you would see in a typical file system. But if I create a folder here, and let's call this sample folder, and I'll click Save, it looks like any traditional type of a file structure hierarchy where I would have a root level and then folders branching off. But actually, this is just done visually. On the back end, for a developer's purpose, this is all flat architecture. So if I were to actually upload a file into this folder, it is technically on the exact same level as this file. It's basically just attaching, again, key name prefixes. So it would attach a prefix to whatever file I would put into this particular folder, but it would not be on a different level than the file that is not in the folder. So just kind of an important fact to understand about folders, especially if you are looking at this from a developer standpoint. So again, in summary, S3 is AWS's bulk storage service, and you can upload any type of file that you want and store them in S3 buckets. With buckets just being the main container, objects being the files that you upload, and folders being a way for you to help organize and visually separate objects within S3. So next, we're going to move in and talk about S3 permissions, but for now, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.